Hey everyone, we're going to get started. Welcome to CDW's Remote Office Centric Security webinar. My name is Phil Clowetter, and I am an account executive with the enterprise sales team at CDW Canada. As a reminder, it's Tuesday, or as I like to call it, Season 3, Episode 2 of Working From Home. So we'll just jump over to our agenda here. So quick review of our agenda. I will do a short introduction to CDW, and then our experts will take it in for the rest from the work from home, what are our customers doing, security infrastructure, endpoint security, virtual desktop infrastructure, collaboration, user policy, and awareness training. We'll do a short, quick and answer period. Please enter your questions into the Q&A section in WebEx, and we will get to those at the end. And next slide. So here's just a representation of CDW's global reach. We do have Canadian offices 9 across the country, but we are a global organization. As our customers are growing, we are growing to and evolving to meet the needs of our customers. So we'll just pop over to the next slide. So we'll look at Canada. We're just going to pause for a second. We have a technical problem. Sorry about that. Now we can get back on the road. So this is our Canadian operations for CDW Canada. We have over 900 coworkers in Canada, 9 offices across the country. Essentially, we have an office wherever there is a NHL team. No coincidence there by any means. Currently, we have 290 IT-specific workers, and last year we did over 1.2 billion in revenue. So our team talking to you today is Theo Van Wyk, who is our head of cybersecurity. We have KJ Burke, who is our manager of solution architects, and Ivo Weens, who is our manager of security solutions architect. If you do not know who your CDW account manager is, please give me an email with my email on the screen, and I can connect you with them. And as mentioned, we'll be reviewing all questions at the end of the presentation. Please enter those into WebEx, and we will get to those. Team, over to you.
Theo, were you able to rejoin? I don't know if you're there yet. Having some audio issues on your end. So
yeah, I'm not seeing Theo in the list. Oh, he just joined.
Okay, we'll give him a couple more seconds. And again, feel free to use the chat to send questions. I just saw that one question came in. KJ and I will be joining Theo for the Q&A session at the end. Feel free to send those questions via chat, like I said.
Hi, team. Can you guys hear me okay now?
Another minute. We can hear you clear now, Theo. Welcome.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry, I was on the attendee list there for a second, so I couldn't unmute myself.
Oh, there you go.
Perfect. So thank you very much. Apologies for the hiccup there. Of course, Murphy's Law is as we're ready to get going, things will tend to happen. But thank you very much for the patience there. And thank you, Phil, for the introduction and getting everything set up. If we can click over to the next slide, please, Robert. So, thank you again very much for taking the time and joining us today. One of the big things here for us in the last few weeks has just been to see how our customers have reached out to us and how they have interacted. And we really want to get, once we get to the question and answer phase, would love to have more of your input there and just make sure that you get some of the questions from us, because as Ivo and Kate and I dug into this topic and we talked to customers and looked through this more and more, we realized how wide and complex this topic really is, but we saw a lot of fundamentals that continuously resurfaced over and over again. So when we look at the remote office-centric security, and Robert, you can go through, there's six elements. You can build all of them out for the moment, please. And I'll talk sort of through them as we go. So the first element that we find that our customers really come and talk to us about is focused around security infrastructure. So the first questions that popped up, a lot of the elements that came up, and even discussions that we're having today is around capacity planning, licensing, features, how do we integrate this? Can we handle this sudden shift in users now working remotely and providing secure connectivity and all the monitoring and security services that wraps around it? On the second topic that then naturally comes up from that very heavily is endpoint security. And in endpoint security today, we'll look a little bit about MFA, disk encryption, end user training, also settings around the end user's actual home office and environment. Definitely like this is the new extension of the office. So a lot of considerations and a lot of things that customers are asking and looking to explore around that. Item 3 and 4, we've broken out because they are somewhat different, but fundamentally, conceptually, they are the same in that we're looking at VDI. So you're either looking at your traditional VPN security that I'll talk about a little bit more, where users are VPNing in and you're building an extension of your fabric in your head office or your data center or wherever you decide to land your users, or the optional route that we see a lot of our customers go today is utilizing VDI. So VDI being virtual desktop infrastructure. That's something like a WebEx, or like a Centric session that you can present the user with a desktop environment, but it never actually leaves the premise. Also a good option if you're looking at BYOD and having users use their own endpoint infrastructure or endpoint gear to connect to the network. And we'll talk a little bit about around the comment for VDI cloud versus VDI on-premise, some of the considerations that we're seeing with customers there. And then second last year is the collaboration security, sort of on the fringe, but something that's really come up now. So, just what are your users doing? How are they using things like file sharing? How are they doing things like WebEx meetings, collaboration over the internet? And if you've watched Zoom and if you've at all read the news, you would have seen a lot of information around Zoom and some of the security flaws and concerns that users have had there. And we'll briefly touch base on that as well. And then the sixth one, and that's the large arrows at the bottom there because it really underscores everything. And as we were building out the content, it really touched every element of the solution there, was around the user policy and awareness training. So it's just, this is your people is your first line of defense and your last line of defense. And this is interesting times and different times, somewhat emotional times. And the bad actors and threat actors out there are aware of this and they know this. And so we need to train people to work in this new environment. And we'll talk a little bit more about policies and procedures, just sort of the things to look out for as we dive into that one. Next slide, please, Robert. So one of the questions that we get quite often is, what are other customers doing? So slightly talked about this already in the previous slide, but sort of re-summarizing this here, we're getting a lot of requests and we're seeing a lot of activity with our customers around updates and patching. So things such as endpoint scanning solutions, like how do I change my Tenable or my Nessus or my endpoint or my scanner into something that I can scan and have proper coverage of these new attack footprints and attack infrastructure. Security infrastructure related questions around patching and updates. So how do I upgrade to the latest firmwares or the latest patches, leveraging many times not just for security-based patching, but to leverage that new feature set that's been in the new version of the firmware that we haven't updated to. So a lot of questions and activity that we see from our customers, making sure security infrastructure is up to date and with the latest stable releases to leverage feature sets embedded in there. VDI golden image. So KJ here, being the expert, can talk a lot around this for us when we get to the Q&A. But just sort of what are you doing with your golden image, and how are we treating that to ensure that we're instilling the right amount of security on a VDI golden image, and what are the differences between how I would secure my traditional endpoint versus this image when I present it to my end users. On cloud-based services, we're getting a number of questions. Really, this year is driven for us around collaboration solutions. Needless to say, most of the collaboration solutions that people are examining runs off of a SaaS platform. So a lot of inquiries around a lot of work that we've done with customers around capacity planning solutions in the cloud specifically. So as you know, as you see some vendors and some organizations having supply chain impact, how do I get hardware? How do I get compute? How do I get the ability to handle this inflow? And in some cases, the answer for some organizations here is actually to tackle capacity solution planning via the cloud. Access solutions, we're seeing the same concept around spin up. So here we have SASE. That's definitely one of the elements that we're looking at as well. Is if your on-prem VPN infrastructure does not support it, or if you have services in the cloud, customers are looking to potentially adopt and jump on this and embrace the ability to do VPN straight to cloud access. SaaS services as well, like we had mentioned, a number of these services just embedded in SaaS, customers looking to potentially move it off-prem and hosting it in cloud. Where there was thinking about it before, this has been a strong driver for people to actually move ahead on those plans. For capacity planning, touched on this recently as well. A lot of requests around licenses for existing solutions. Can I scale my VPN, my multi-factor authentication? Are there new users that before was not in scope for these solutions that now are, and how do I accommodate those? And then we're looking at, again, leveraging cloud-based solutions. Like you'll see these two sort of overlap a little bit around cloud capacity training when you cannot get that on-prem hardware or it's not convenient to do that. What can I do from a virtual perspective, or a cloud-based perspective? Authentication being key here. At the end of the day, it's about securing that end user. So a lot of work and a lot of questions that we've seen around organizations maturing, accelerating, or building out a multi-factor and single sign-on solution set to make sure that they can provide secure remote access to users. And then also a lot of questions around directory services for federated directory sharing and ability to authenticate users as they come into these services. Next slide, please, Robert. The first one that I want to dive into here is really focused around the security infrastructure. And when we look at some of the recommendations that we've seen here, and we'll vary today between policy, process, and people as we work through these. The majority of the people recommendations you'll see embedded a little bit towards the training. And like I said, once we dig into this, there's a lot of depth here, and we try to give a good summary, but please feel free in the question section to make sure that you get out of these elements that's relevant to you, where you want to do a deeper dive into with us in the last 15 minutes there. But primarily, we're looking at deploying remote access solutions. And so we're seeing customers look at whether it's an expansion of their VPN, whether it's VDI, or whether it's a secure access service edge, such as a SASE solution to get that access to a cloud edge. What we find is organizations would have either have one of these projects in flight or have infrastructure built around it, and those are usually the ones that we see accelerate. There are some of our customers that are tackling new initiatives, but generally one of the recommendations we have for customers right now is while a lot of our customers had amazing pressure on them to expand and build, we wanted to be sure that this was done in a very systematic way, because having all your users offsite and remote, you have to ensure that you provide that excellent user experience. And so in many cases, we do caution customers against wildly launching new solutions just for the sake of launching them. But if it's in a structured way or a project that's embraced and you have the resources available, a lot of our customers are diving into the opportunity to really roll out solutions that they would not have, may not have been on the forefront or at everybody's mind. And when we look at our security infrastructure, one of the big things that you should consider is enabling strong authentication and MFA wherever that is supported. So look at those feature sets, look at where it can be integrated. The name of the game here is to stop bad actors from getting credentials. And we'll talk about that as one of the top attack vectors in a little bit as well. So consider condition-based sign-on and access more and more, especially around the cloud solutions, but also a number of the load balancing proxy-based front-end solutions that we have will allow you to look at condition-based sign-on. Now, what is this? If you're not familiar with condition-based sign-on, this is the concept of doing correlation between a user, different elements of a user's authentication process. So you can start looking at things like location. Is this user logging in from Canada? Is it connecting from an overseas country? And if so, should that be? And what are the authentication steps? So if they're logging in from an area that is not familiar, the answer here would be to force a higher level of authentication on the user, or it might just plain be to drop the connection and to force re-authentication. So the elements of making things like geographic markers, time of login, user behaviors, type of resources that are being accessed. If you have the ability and you have on endpoints clients that can do posture-based checking, it's looking, can you bake that in? So based on the level of AV and the type of assets that users are connecting to these services, can I start distinguishing different authentication schemes that I would, or potentially access list that gets applied accordingly. Update to the latest software firmware. This is one that you'll see across, there's a few that, well, I'll just say in advance, you will see this across the board because it's critical for each one. Here at CDW, we refer to them as the fundamentals because they're not basic, they're not easy, but everybody knows that we should do them. So, you know, again, we recommend this. You'll see this everywhere. Make sure that you're up to date on the latest stable version that's patched for the known 0 days and threats out there. And of course, we acknowledge this is not as easy as just patching everything inside. There's definitely like testing cycles, release cycles, and making sure that you have the right experience and expertise on hand should any of these patches go awry. Public-facing infrastructure. This year, we've seen a huge uptake, and we recommend looking at solutions such as next-generation firewalling, application firewalling, and also proxy-style services. So with a lot of VDI servers, RDP interfaces to the internet, how are we encrypting it? Are we landing that through a VPN, as an example? Or does it make sense to put a proxy-based solution in front to give that critical infrastructure some layer of protection directly from the internet? And then conduct vulnerability scanning, especially against external facing infrastructure, something that is easily forgotten. We're standing up, a lot of organizations are standing up a significant amount of new infrastructure or expansions. And it's definitely worth going back once this is standing up and doing your basic vulnerability scanning and testing against it, because rest assured that is what the bad actors out there will be doing as soon as you have that stood up. Next slide, please, Robert. And then sort of expansion of the security infrastructure elements. On top of all of this, so we've built this, we're giving access to people. Now the next step is let's make sure that we're monitoring the behavior and how users are accessing this. Two of the main solutions here that we see a lot of organizations embracing or trying to leverage the feature sets that they may have had already on security solutions is around SIM and UEBA. So these become things like, am I collecting the correct logs? So you're building out new infrastructure, you're rolling out new solutions. Am I collecting the correct logs and information for my use cases and correlations to be meaningful, or am I collecting them at all? Is it something new that has been stood up? And it's something that we have to make sure that we're collecting that log information. So make sure you're capturing relevant logs so that your use cases and monitoring can do what it is intended to do. On top of that, we're now looking at applying enhanced monitoring and behavioral analysis. So these can be as simple as checkboxes for analytical models that's available, or they can be as complex as writing your own use cases. This is an excellent opportunity to work with your vendors and your security partners, look at which use cases makes more sense and which is more applicable for work from home scenarios. And this again could be things like correlating location-based access with time, with what the resources are accessing and data volumes being transferred. A lot of this will depend on the type of log sources and logging that you have available to you. But once you've established it, definitely consider what you can do with those. When you look at, so we talked about up cases and use cases, but rolling out of this, as you're making these decisions, now is also a good time to reassess your risk-based approach. A lot of the questions that you're going to be asking yourself and looking around security, especially things like asset classification, understanding which kind of services and how to classify my services, and then looking at security and access policies should be done with a risk-based approach. It is, if you have a very strong remote worker policy or work from home policy, you may be further down the line in reassessing risk against these workers or against the end users and how they access services. But if this is a fairly new space for you or suddenly ramped up or the scene has changed, do not forget to go back and look at this, because this can help you prioritize your spend, your security, and where you need to focus your energy and effort. Certificate management and security. This is one often overlooked. Ivo and I had a number of conversations about this one over the next while. It's one of those things that when it works properly and it's running in the background, nobody knows and it doesn't bother you. But once it goes wrong, it can cause quite a lot of hiccups. With so many of the attacks vectors and the attack types from bad actors looking at stealing credentials, being able to eliminate that man in the middle is critical right now. And so you need to, whenever possible, make sure that we provide a seamless security environment and certificate environment for our users so that we do not condition them to clicking on sites that does not have proper certificates deployed. On top of that, if you're in the middle of your DR situation and suddenly your certificates decide to expire, you can cause quite a bit of headache. So take a moment, reassess, look at your certificates, make sure that the validity and the time is on there and that they're good to go, and just get ahead of those. This is one of those often overlooked things that can cause a lot of issues when it does go wrong. And then in addition to the actual vulnerability testing, when everything is, if it is, and you looked at that risk-based approach and you decide that this is a mission critical environment, it might be worth considering a penetration test against this new attack surface to understand if anything from a configuration perspective was missed, or if there's anything else that is worth tweaking while you have that environment stood up. Next slide, please, Robert. So here's the big one, endpoint security. I'm assuming we'll get quite a bit of questions around this, but we've really tried to distill this down for you. And this is where it starts blurring more, because you're moving closer to your user, and so much of the security around this potentially could depend on your user. And while we will dive into that in a moment, for endpoint security here, what we're looking for, again, there's your very quintessential top of the list, update and patching endpoints, right? Let's make sure those endpoints are patched, get users to apply updates, just keep that as current as we can, because the bad actors are really aware of that right now, and they're actively looking for new gaps in the armor. Deploy endpoint protection solutions. So for example, AV, we've got some questions that we'll address later on around different types of endpoints. We'll quickly look at that, or different types of protection for your endpoints. But the reality is, make sure that you have updated AV and protection of at least of some kind out there with updated signatures. That's step number one, and that's critical in moving ahead. Table stakes, if you will, but again, a fundamental that's not always as basic as people think, but let's make sure we work on that one. And then once you're comfortable with this, the other option here would become to consider endpoint detection and response type solutions. So these are EDR-based solutions where you are now actually doing monitoring, in-depth behavioral analysis. You can start looking at processes and really understand more around the monitoring and helping your endpoints with the end users respond to threats and remediate and help address elements and solutions there. Now, needless to say, there's a wide range here, and they tie very neatly back into monitoring and your SIM and logging-based solutions. So again, consider how we tie those into each other. And as these infrastructure roll out, let's make sure that your endpoints are logging correctly, and these solutions are bringing the logs back to where you would expect it. Implement single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. Again, users are just, especially now, are going to be using passwords to the nth degree to log into various portals and let various items. So if you have a single sign-on to help make that more seamless and get around the concept of reuse of passwords and keeping it more complex, now is the time to help push that out. And then where applicable, let's deploy MFA, look at what multi-factor authentication solutions can do for you to get around that credential phishing and credential threat element that the attackers pose. Enable endpoint encryption. One element that you can dig quite a lot into here becomes the physical element security of a home office. Now, I'd like to believe that most home offices, at least, is in the user's, being in the user's home, they have a certain level of security applied to that. The reality is, though, you have to make sure that your data is protected. And one of the fastest ways to do that, to get around an endpoint or a lost device, as we know, is endpoint encryption. This, while we have some vendors that has very comprehensive solutions, this does not have to be. This can be native to the operating system, whatever the features that you can enable there, if it makes sense to safely do so. Definitely something that we very strongly recommend. Enforce strong/complex password policy. Now, there's always a ton of discussions when it comes around passwords and whether that is truly as effective as security as we'd like to. But I'll tell you one thing, not having a password or a very weak password definitely is a lack of security. So if nothing else in this time, let's make sure that users are using strong, complex passwords, and potentially let's pick a suitable refresh password expiry and refresh time frame. Obviously, you do not want to fatigue your users and overburden them, but at the same time, we want to make sure that there is a healthy amount of security that we're applying in this environment to potentially make it more difficult for attackers. Ensure data and endpoints are being backed up properly. So in addition, once you've protected that data from theft, then now let's also protect the data and the user and the productivity. So let's look at, we recommend looking at various kind of backup solutions, either whether that is something that is a synchronized folder, such as a OneDrive, where this synchronizing the data up, or whether that becomes an actual full endpoint backup solution that pulls backup data backups up to a backup server. Tons of options available to you here, but just make sure that that is within your consideration, and that's something that is being looked at. Consider measures to protect users from web-based threats. So as your users are moving off-premise, I don't think this is new. I believe majority of customers are already dealing with this in one way or another, thanks to cloud and SaaS offerings. But this could be anything around, do I have CASB-style protections in the cloud that will help protect my cloud services, all the way down to, do I have DNS-based security from certain vendors, for instance, to do quick URL-style filtering and protection directly on endpoints to help protect my users. Next one, please, Robert. So now move back a little bit towards VDI, so number 3 and 4 that we had on that the deck there. And really the big thing here is protect that VDI RDP interface. One of the biggest threats is in the rush to get connectivity up. We've seen some cases, quite a number of cases, where RDP is exposed directly to the internet. RDP inherently does have a number of security flaws, so when it's absolutely necessary, make sure there's compensating and mitigating controls. But in the perfect world here, what we would recommend is either to have a proxy in front of that provides you some form of protection, or to have a VPN-based landing where we can put some form of a gate or a segmentation and bring in users and give them an opportunity to authenticate before they have access to these services. So definitely we recommend looking at those options. Around golden image protection, a lot of discussion that I've seen around here as well with customers. So how much do you scan for vulnerabilities, but that you definitely do want to scan your golden image, make sure that that you identify any security flaws in there, update and patch accordingly. Fully understanding that updating a golden image and pushing that back out to hosts is not trivial. There's considerations that has to be done very carefully, but absolutely critical. So bake that into your process and workflow and consider that very, very carefully. And then balance resource preservation and selected security measures. Of course, one of the elements of a golden image is, as I'm loading up on my VDI, as I load up with security tool sets, I'm placing more resource drain on my infrastructure. And the secret here becomes deciding on that magic balance. Now, there's a lot of elements that we will work with, that your security provider can work with you in baking in here. And that becomes things such as how are users accessing, how are you protecting your infrastructure on the front end? That can help mitigate some of the risks. But once you get onto your golden image, at the very least, make sure to have a basic form of antivirus or protection on there, because even those VDI sessions are vulnerable as users are browsing and moving through the internet and working on them on a day-to-day basis. And then integrate your single sign-on and MFA solutions. Again, like patching and updates, one of those elements that you'll just see reflected all the way through, because it is so critical and vital to helping us make the life for bad actors more difficult. And then enable session encryption. Believe it or not, we do see quite a few instances still where people are opening RDP directly and they're allowing unencrypted sessions. If you're not wrapping that with a VPN or a different form of transportation protection on the way in, especially, definitely something to consider. You do not want to avoid man-in-the-middle attacks, or especially where a lot of users now will be coming in from public infrastructure or unknown wireless access points that they've either not accessed before, that really is more consumer grade than you would normally have for your users. Consider DDoS protection. As organizations are moving users out, we have work from home everywhere. Needless to say, the organization becomes more sensitive towards DDoS. If somebody takes out your VDI portal or your VDI front end, that really has become a much more significant hit on your productivity. So consider some of these solutions for on-prem, but especially also in cloud. Your cloud-based infrastructure will have fantastic options that's really powerful as well to help protect and prevent attacks, DDoS attacks against your infrastructure. And then cloud-based VDI, again, there's a lot to be said here potentially, but what we just wanted to make sure that's really critical is if you are new to cloud, be very careful of adopting the strategy. And if you do, consider the proper cloud-based security measures that wraps around not just this environment, but any cloud environment that you're standing up in terms of how you're landing and authenticating administrators and users that has access to the infrastructure. So work with your security providers here to remember that this is not just about the VDI configuration. There's that extra layer of how am I protecting it from a cloud perspective and what is unique in those scenarios. Next slide, please, Robert. Now the big one, collaboration. Now this has been in the news a lot, thanks to Zoom and some of the other, even some of the other solutions out there. If you watched the news a few nights ago, there was examples of different groups with people randomly dropping into Zoom sessions and any other collaboration sessions that uses random pins without passwords. So again, getting into your corporate instances, there's the famous SSO and MFA, and you'll obviously patch and make sure that we're running the latest versions on there. So you'll see bullet 1 and 2 everywhere. Focus on that. Let's make sure we have that under control. But then the next one here becomes more of a end user ability. Some of the solutions in the market space allows you to set default configurations and default behaviors in the applications. If they do, leverage that accordingly as you see fit. But the reality is here, we want to focus on things like meeting passwords. Make sure that your meetings are locked with password and it's secured. We want to make sure that you're protecting your meeting IDs. When you're sharing it out, even if you have passwords enabled, a lot of the collaboration solutions allows you to embed the password in that one-click link. Be aware of this, or educate your users on this, because even with that password, if they advertise that link incorrectly or people get a hold of that, they can still get in. Check attendees. So you're in the Zoom, you're in your WebEx, you're in your GoToMeeting, and you're starting your session. It's worth, if it's a sensitive meeting, it's worth doing a double check. Just quickly scan, make sure that the names that's showing up are familiar. Call out, make sure if it's a number or somebody you do not see. A lot of these platforms have lock options. So once you have attendees set up and running, you can actually lock so that users are placed in a waiting room before they come in. Again, a good security measure if it is a very sensitive for items that you're discussing. And set the join and leave chimes. So just that, as as stereotypical that it is to hear the bing and somebody asks who just joined, it's still a good practice to track your attendees and make sure as people come and go that you're aware of who's in your room and who's participating. And then for file sharing, there's 2 elements of file sharing here. The first one that we definitely recommend avoiding, if at all possible, is file sharing through your collaboration sessions on actual video collaboration. If it's in a closed lock room with very restricted participants, that is better. But we've actually seen some attack vectors where people will drop in unannounced on these sessions and drop an affected PDF on the file. And as you can imagine, as you're sitting there listening to your web video or web conference, and suddenly a file pops up on the side, the temptation to go and click on that file will be overwhelming for a majority of users. So just be very careful of considering this. When you're actually looking at cloud-based or SaaS file sharing offerings, again here, look at something and consider something like a CASB, like a cloud security, like the cloud security access brokers. What you want to do here is leverage some of that DLP functionality, potentially see what kind of content people are putting up in the cloud. The other thing is just in a lot of cases, a CASB solution will give you types of visibility into what's happening in your applications that you can then feed back into that monitoring tool set. And then the other item as well is just be aware of public versus internal access capabilities. If you're using certain types of, even like Microsoft SharePoint or other type of file collaboration, just be aware whether users have the ability to make those links and those file shares available publicly, and make sure that your policy provides some sort of guidance for users around it, that they're aware of the capability that that application presents should they have that type of access. Next slide, please. So user policy and awareness training. This in itself can be an hour-long webinar. There is another webinar that we're doing tomorrow. Feel free to sign in there, where they'll dig a little bit, where our risk advisory group will dig a little bit more into the actual user and awareness elements of it. What we did want to highlight here today for you, sort of in tying this back into more from a corporate perspective, is to look and develop and communicate an acceptable use policy. If you have one already, reassess, see if it's required to consider things such as corporate user, BYOD strategy. Is there elements that you need to bake in? Usually we find once it's even a fairly generic acceptable use policy will cover a lot of the items required. It becomes more a case of extracting the language from legal terminology into a training session where the user understands what the impact is and understand the why. So definitely work on that and guiding the users and employees and end users on the use of the corporate assets and the intent behind these policies. It is important that they're following these rules and guidelines. And then for phishing, tons of phishing right now. It is one of the biggest attack vectors we're seeing, in addition to web and drive-by. People are playing off of social media. They're playing off of fear. They're playing off of just straightforward people being overwhelmed with links and new communication methods. So especially we're seeing a lot of COVID-19 related scams. So there's a lot of useful information, and we can link and provide you content too around guidelines for your users, things to do, sort of the basic handful of checks that you can run through on emails if you think it is suspicious. But definitely worth digging into this here. There's also we have very focused, dedicated phishing campaigns that we're seeing that's targeting customers and organizations specifically around things like password resets, attempts to get into help desks because help desks are overwhelmed with remote users. A lot of cases, a lot of remote help desk doesn't have clear policies for distribution of passwords and password resets. So definitely an area where, in addition to the phishing, where the sort of phishing meets that social engineering element, to consider that, is your help desk trained up? Is there appropriate policies? Is it worth re-communicating this out to your users and making them comfortable with how to operate, and also for your help desk to understand the avenues available to help users without putting you at risk? And then, from a Good Samaritan perspective, try to provide some security guidance from your home for your users on their home and Wi-Fi configuration. If this is something where with some basic guidelines, you can help secure Wi-Fi through better use of passwords, maybe set up some guest networks. We've had one customer that actually looked at repurposing a number of old wireless access points that they just pulled out of branches. And so they pre-configured that with them with some best practice use settings, identified the users that were most likely to be a target of attack, and just distributed out to these users to help provide some form of layered security. So all ways to be creative, but in the essence, it is just helping users set up that end user environment at home for them to be more comfortable around the security elements that they should consider. One other element here too that sort of ties between protecting your end users, your desktop, and your infrastructure is just make sure that your anti-spam policies and solutions are up to speed. Just because we're seeing such a significant amount of phishing attacks, update your dictionaries, make sure that URL checks and URL databases on these solutions are up to speed. And again, users being your first and last line, and in between, we're layering technology to try and help prevent and keep these users secure and productive. Next slide, please. So with that, 3 minutes to spare there for the 45. I'd like to open this up to questions. If there's any questions, I believe KJ and Ivo is going to help us moderate off of the chat box, and we'll also help answering some of those. So, gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks, Theo.
Hey,
So I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Theo. Or go ahead, Ivo.
No, I was just going to bring attention to the one question that came through the Q&A. I think it's you addressed it to some extent already, Theo, but you know, considering all the attention that's been turned towards Zoom lately, issues with vulnerabilities, lack of proper encryption, routing issues with China, and everything that's come up with it lately, you know, it's obviously the sign of a new organization getting a lot of attention at a unprecedented time, right? So if you're an organization that has invested into Zoom as your corporate collaboration tool, one of your corporate collaboration tools, you know, and I think I'd like to open more for discussion really between us is what are the factors that you want to take into consideration? I'm assuming that it's just a matter of days before Zoom comes up with yet another patch and another fix for these issues and their encryption issues. But in the meantime, what can users do to make sure that important data is not leaked out of the organization? And what other tools are out there for collaboration that we can use in the meantime to protect ourselves?
Absolutely. So from my side, you know, one of the recommendations we obviously will have, and we sort of briefly touched on that too, is just consider when you are sharing your files and you know, who are you getting access? Where is that being placed into? The unfortunate reality is a lot of users, as the question indicated, is just deeply invested with Zoom. And again, just be aware of that. I mean, you have to also consider the risk with some, you know, irony is it's a little bit of a herd mentality here with enough traffic and enough people using Zoom. It's not, there's a lot of traffic out there. There's a lot of sessions. Unfortunately, it does mean that if you get targeted based on that, there is a threat. There is a threat, but I would say update regularly, you know, continue using the information, but this may be worth that if certain types of meetings, certain types of information, if it is sensitive enough, follow that risk-based approach, understand if it's worth collaborating and sharing files directly on Zoom, or is that something that a different distribution method for the information is viable or required until that is patched or addressed.
Yeah, Theo,
yeah, go ahead, KJ. I keep interrupting you.
I think it was really interesting, you know, one of the things you pointed out earlier, and that's really around sort of user training and getting your users to do the right things. And regardless of what collaboration tool you're using, making sure that the attendee list is validated and you don't have somebody in your collaboration session that shouldn't be. Oh, we lost somebody. And then you know, again, having the smart user that isn't going to open up that attachment or isn't going to cause that problem by you know, opening attachments they shouldn't be, right? So I think it's most important to keep in mind that in times of change like this, your user base is really sort of your biggest vulnerability, but they're also your biggest asset. So communicating with them and making sure that they're doing the right things and they're following the right security protocols, and maybe they're just questioning things a little bit more in this time than they normally would. I think that's a big advantage to get out there, and it's just communication, right?
Right. Absolutely agree. It's great points. I think it was Mario. I was reading through the Q&A there. Mario also, you know, mentioned that he has no issues with free software. And again, I completely agree, Mario. If it's the free version of something that is enterprise grade or potentially enterprise, and you're using it for the correct use with the correct considerations, there's no reason why you could not look at that and potentially leverage it. Just understand the risk, think it through, and apply the required amount of policy and understanding of the business around how you leverage those solutions. Next question.
Yeah, I think really there was a little bit of back and forth around Zoom and sort of what the current state is there. I think that was primarily.
Yeah, there was some conversation also around. Sorry, this is Ivo here.
Okay.
Some of the emails that came through email were more specific to, how to. First of all, what is the greatest security risk currently? I don't know if that's been answered. I dropped off audio there for a second.
Okay, I can quickly touch base on that one. So we get that one a lot. I think right now, the biggest security risk here is credential theft and phishing. So it's just the attackers are smart. They realize users are out. They're more emotional. They're going to go after them. Now the question then becomes, how do you want to define threat? Is it the attack vector? So that would be things like email, social engineering, and potentially web. Those are three really significant ones we see. And then if you want to attack, if you want to ask about threat from a risk-based perspective, it's really going after data, gaining access, and then the gaining access is really either a remote access style landing on a platform that's not secured but connected to corporate environment, or around end user credentials. So is this something where I can scoop the right required credentials and pose as your user and move into the network?
And Theo, I know as we've been having conversation with customers, one of the things that resonates on that is really multi-factor authentication. Can you maybe explain the differences between our customers that are protecting those user credentials with MFA and those that aren't, and kind of what the exposure difference is?
Absolutely. So when you look at it at the heart of the essence, as when you roll out the MFA, any form of MFA, what I'm really trying to do is just get around the one-time use, or that use of the password that's universal everywhere. So we typically see multi-factor teamed up with single sign-on, meaning that once your system is signed in and has that credentials ready to go, you can move between applications as long as it's from that system. But usually you front that with a multi-factor. So whether that's, even though there's a lot of discussion around how secure text-based multi-factor is, I absolutely agree. If you're really truly a target, there's ways to get around that. It is still better than a static weak password. But once you go on top of that and you start looking at things such as fobs or even software tokens on phones, the ability for multi-factor is just to, you have your username, you log in there, you plug in your password, which is your next step, and then give it that one-time item that even if the whole thought is just, even if that session is being captured and key recorded by an attacker, by the time they can actually act on that information, it is invalid again. And that is really the driver for us around multi-factor. And so when you consider where to roll it out and where to deploy multi-factor, you want to think about that attack surface. It's all those gates where potentially you either are locking away very sensitive information, or it's more of a public style access that if somebody were to come across your password and username, how do I protect from them leveraging that in a malicious way? And that becomes that extra form of authentication, whether that's through a text or a software token. So those are really the big considerations, and why you will see it everywhere, because it gets around that. If I get a hold of your username and password, you have another layer of security that's protecting you that still keeps me out of the system.
Perfect. One of the questions that came during our registration time, and I think it was a really important question, and I think I would love to hear your answer on it, Theo, was how does the recent changes in remote working impact ISO 27001 certifications, and what does that mean for organizations that have that or are in the process of getting that certification?
Right. So there's two. I like to deconstruct that one into two elements. There's the element of trying to obtain certification and being audited, and that right now would be not impossible, would be very tricky because a lot of the audit in this case here, aside from the fact that it's difficult to audit in COVID-19 situations, would have to focus around the work from home policy element. So you're going to have to, in your information security management program as part of ISO, you will have to bake in a work from home, whether that's through a BCP or a DR or just regular day-to-day activity for that class of user. And so being audited against that becomes a lot more difficult in that scenario. Now, on the flip side, if you are ISO compliant and the intent is to maintain to preserve the intent behind it, I think the real issue here is, again, you want to look at that risk management approach. You want to look at how your policies are defined so that you're explaining to users what some of the restrictions are around data protection, access control, physical access to devices. And there's cases where some of your users may just, if they work with certain types of information, the answer there again, if you layer it with two-factor authentication and enforce certain type of policies and do it through a VDI, so the content never physically leaves, and your best practice configuration on VDI is preventing them from copying files from the VDI host down onto the endpoint. These are elements that can be considered to make sure that you're designing the environment to help stay true to the ISO, what you're trying to accomplish with your ISO certification.
Perfect. That sounds good. But another question that was also sent to us during the registration was, what features and functionality does WebEx have with Cvent? And then probably the thoughts were, as we were sending this out and inviting people, they wanted to know not only, do we practice what we preach with WebEx here and what we're doing? So I'm assuming the question comes from that perspective.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I did a quick dive looking into that one, and WebEx actually, both Cvent and WebEx actually has pretty comprehensive guides around what is included in terms of passing meeting attendees back and forth between the event, how they authenticate, how they exchange information, and how meeting data is shared. I think today would be a difficult forum to really deep dive into that, but if that is of concern, if you want to know more about that, there's the email for Phil, or reach out to your CDW account executive, and we can put you in contact either with our resident Cisco expert that can help answer that, or we can help get that information relevant to the nature of your ask and make sure that we're answering that correctly.
Perfect. There's been one of the questions that was asked too was any recommendations, and I think you touched on this a little bit for the increasing incoming phishing emails to users. Any other thoughts or recommendations you would give around that piece? I know you touched on the security awareness piece, but in terms of email controls, what can organizations do to bolster that?
Yeah, I think there's
perspective.
I think phishing is such a significant threat that a lot of the technical controls that are placed are still sufficient. It's more just, are we updating it? Are we aware of it? Are we making sure that users are using the corporate applications that in turn gets routed through these protection measures on the front end? I'd say more now than ever, probably it's very important to set potentially on your Outlook have settings that will not allow images and links to be open automatically. So force that user to stop and think before they click and download images and files, and so that they can go through that first round of inspection. And then the other element around that too is just flagging of emails and just identify to users when an email is not truly originating from within the organization. I know that's a controversial, like I've seen many customers discuss and argue this very many different ways, but at a time like this, it might be worth just flagging that so that users has that extra level of awareness that even though it might look like it's coming from the organization, that they can pick up that this might be an attempt to get around the security. And then at the end of the day, it's just do not overtrain. We also advise against training fatigue, but keep it relevant. Maybe do daily updates, daily awareness. If an example of a phishing email is found, it might not be a bad idea to share that out to your users with a quick deconstruct and 1 or 2 pointers and say, here's why this was a phishing attack, and here's the kind of things you should do. Get users buy-in and get them familiar. Just start instilling that behavior for reading the emails a certain manner.
And I think the last question that I had here, Theo, and I'm open if anybody wants to throw another one into the Q&A, we can definitely read them. But this one was really talking about updating user acceptance policies. And I think, as I try to dissect a little bit what that means, I think the first question is, when is the right time to do it? Is now the right time to go and update user, get users to agree to a new user acceptance policy? And if it is or if it isn't, when it is time to do it, what are the areas that we need to revisit? What are the important pieces? Knowing that this is the temporary new normal, and preparing for anything like this again if it were to happen. What are the areas that an organization needs to be concerned about?
So you've asked a ton of questions in there. We can unpack a lot of those. I think there's elements of those that, no, that's all good. I think there's elements in those that is definitely worth talking to your security partners and working through those that are just, that has a lot of elements to consider. But I think in essence, if you do not have, or if you're making changes to a end user policy or user acceptable use policy and you want to communicate to the users, it is very important, I would say at this stage, to convey intent. So explain when you are doing, like take a moment, extract it from the legalese and give an example to explain to users why you're putting the things in place that you're putting in place. The reality is we do not do these things just to police people and police our end users. First and foremost, they're designed to safeguard the users, which in turn safeguards us. And if we can communicate it in that manner, I believe that goes a great way to users understanding like these are different times. Users that's never worked remotely before has the opportunity or must work remotely. So how do we communicate that to them, and how do we help them embrace that and understand that we're doing these things to protect them? There is an element of this that is just pure protection, and like unfortunately sometimes end users does not like when you tell them what they can and cannot do. But the reality of that is that happens as well. So there will be some cases where you can articulate it as well as you can, but it's just a hard line that we have to draw with the risk associated to it. Those might be a little bit more difficult. In actual considerations, when you look at the actual end user acceptance policy, I'd say the big focus around that we're seeing a lot is around corporate use of corporate assets. And the reality is there's always a little bit of bleed between personal use. Somebody open up a browser to look at something, like check a quick Gmail or do something. What is the reality? What is your corporate policy? What is your stance towards that? And making sure that users understand that differentiator. I think that is a big area for that acceptable use policy to consider right now. For
sure. No, that's really good. There's a couple more questions that came in through our Q&A. I know we're running up to the hour. One of them was, and I think maybe we'll try one more question, and then we'll also send some answers via text, via email, I should say. Text answers via email to everybody that's participated, so we can continue the conversation after this is complete. But the question is, do you find many companies embracing BYOD, and how would a company ensure the security of the endpoint that is not owned by the business? For example, allowing AnyConnect to install on a user's home machine, for instance, and how would we control that sort of situation?
Yes, so we do see that a lot, especially right now. The short answer is there's no easy answer for BYOD. It is a security topic that gets moved back and forth a lot. The only way to accurately answer this question is from a risk-based approach. So you have to start, you cannot just look at the device and access, you have to start thinking about what am I allowing that user through that BYOD device, and what kind of security measures would I need to implement, ensure that, you start with the worst case thinking, if that device has a mild form of compromise, like what would I do with that device? How would I scan and check? Some organizations dictate that users must accept that BYOD agents and ability to control it. And usually if it's justified by the type of access required to data, users will agree to it. But you do also find organizations that try to, under the circumstances, move productivity forth and balance security. And I think I want to be careful with that one because it's a very wide range, and it really is something that has to be considered carefully with your risk group and with your security partner to understand what are we doing there. How are we using, for instance, conditional based access? If that endpoint device is the user's device, but they have valid I might feel different from that from a device that's an end user device with no AV installed. How do I want to treat that differently? And that, unfortunately, is going to be a very careful consideration. But that is something that feel free, reach out to us or to your security providers, and we can have that conversation with you.
Perfect. So I realize there are a couple of more questions on the Q&A, and we'll be sure to answer those via email. I realize that we've run up to 2 minutes past our allotted time. So Phil, I don't know if you have any closing remarks. I can close this as well. So thank you very much for everybody for joining. If you have any questions, any concerns, there's Phil's email up on the slides. If you have any other questions, we'll continue the conversation via our official communication for this webinar. And again, thank you everybody for joining. And thank you for the highly interactive piece on the Q&A. And have yourselves a good day.